I'm Dale Maddox, 52 years old, retired insurance investigator out of Albany. 30 years I spent across a desk from people trying to sell me a story. Widows who torched their own kitchens, contractors who crashed their own trucks. You do that long enough, something rewires in you. You stop hearing what people say. You start hearing what they don't. I tell you that so you understand what happened next. October. Peak autumn in the Hudson Valley. The kind of weekend God puts together when he's showing off. My younger half-brother Garrett, same father, different mothers, 16 years between us, was about to marry a woman named Elena Voss, art curator, old New England money, the kind of family that summers as a verb. The estate sat on 40 acres of vineyard, rolling gold and copper in every direction. 300 chairs lined up in perfect rows on a manicured slope overlooking the river. White linen, hydrangeas, string quartet warming up near a stone archway wrapped in ivy. Everything looked like the cover of a magazine nobody I know could afford, and something was wrong. I couldn't name it yet. It was just a pressure behind my sternum, the same dull hum I used to get sitting across from a claimant whose paperwork was a little too clean. I'd learned a long time ago not to argue with that feeling. Back in the '09, I ignored it on a marine cargo case. $4 million walked out the door before I caught up with it. Never again. The rehearsal dinner was the night before, held in the estate's main hall. Exposed beams, candlelight bouncing off 100 wine glasses. Garrett stood at the head of the long table with that wide-open grin of his, the one he's had since he was a kid, the one that makes you want to protect him from every sharp thing in the world. Elena sat beside him, composed, graceful, her smile calibrated to exactly the right warmth. Not a hair out of place, not a word too many. Their mother, Linda, Garrett's mother, my stepmother, sat near the middle of the table, laughing too loud, refilling her wine too often, doing that thing she does when she feels outclassed and wants no one to notice. And then there was Constance Voss, Elena's mother, silver-haired, immaculate, seated at the opposite end from Linda with a distance between them that didn't feel accidental. All weekend I'd watched Constance navigate every room Linda entered with a kind of surgical precision, always orbiting, never intersecting. I told myself it was just in-law friction, the usual territorial nonsense. Two women, two worlds, one groom caught in the middle. But Constance excused herself from that dinner table 3 times in 90 minutes, each time with the same tight smile and murmured apology, her phone already pressed to her ear before she cleared the doorway. The first time, nobody blinked. The second time, Elena's eyes tracked her mother out of the room, and I saw something flicker across her face. Just for a half-second, that looked less like concern and more like fear. The third time, I got up to use the restroom. The hallway beyond the dining hall was dim, all stone and old wood. I could hear Constance around the corner, her voice low and rigid, the kind of quiet that takes effort. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop. That's what I told myself as I stopped walking and held my breath. Most of it was muffled. Fragments. Her heels clicking once as she shifted her weight, and then, clear as a bell, 6 words that went through me like ice water. He cannot find out before tomorrow. A pause, then, it will destroy everything. I stood there in that hallway with my back against the cool stone, and I felt something I hadn't felt in 4 years of retirement. That old machinery spinning up behind my ribs. The pattern recognition, the pull. I didn't know who he was. I didn't know what it was. But I knew, the way you know a crack in a foundation before the house starts leaning, that I was standing at the edge of something, and the ground was about to move. I went back to the table. I picked up my glass. Garrett caught my eye and raised his in a toast, that big, dumb, beautiful grin splitting his face wide open. I smiled back, and I said nothing. The ceremony was beautiful. I'll give it that much. 300 chairs filled on that manicured slope, the Hudson rolling silver behind the altar, October maples burning red and gold like the whole valley had dressed up for my brother's big day. A string quartet played something I didn't know the name of. Garrett stood beside me in a charcoal suit, jaw tight, eyes already wet before she'd even appeared. He kept smoothing his tie. I put my hand on his shoulder and squeezed once. He looked at me and grinned like he was 12 years old again. Then Elena came down the aisle and, God help me, she was stunning. Ivory dress, dark hair pinned back with some kind of crystal clip that threw little sparks of light across the grass. She moved like she was gliding, composed, perfect. But I watched her eyes and they found her mother in the second row before they found Garrett. Just a flicker, a check-in. Constance gave a single, barely perceptible nod. The officiant began. Standard language, timeless and steady. Dearly beloved. I remember the breeze coming up off the river, carrying the smell of crushed grapes from the lower vineyard. I remember thinking maybe I'd been wrong. Maybe that phone call was nothing. Maybe I was just a retired investigator who couldn't stop working cases that didn't exist. Then I heard the gravel. It was the sound first. Footsteps, fast, uneven, stumbling, on the stone path that wound through the vineyard gate. 300 heads turned in a wave, front rows last like dominoes falling backward. I saw him before I understood what I was seeing. Late 20s, sport coat wrinkled like he'd slept in it, hair uncombed, face blotched red from crying or drinking or both. He was shaking so hard I could see it from the altar. He shouted Garrett's name. Not once. Twice. The second time his voice broke on the second syllable. I knew that face. Couldn't place it. Then I could. Elena's brother. Marcus. The one who was supposedly backpacking through Portugal. The one nobody had mentioned all weekend without a stiff little smile. He wasn't in Portugal. He was standing 40 feet from the altar holding a manila envelope over his head, and his hands were trembling so badly the papers inside rattled like dry leaves. He was crying openly. "You can't do this," he said. "You can't let them do this." 2 groomsmen moved toward him. Garrett raised a hand and stopped them. That was Garrett, always willing to hear someone out, always assuming the best. What Marcus said next took about 30 seconds. It undid 36 years. He said that Garrett's biological father was not the man we'd both called Dad. He said Garrett's real father was the late Richard Voss, Elena's father. He said Richard and Linda had carried on an affair through most of 1987, and Garrett was the result. He held up a DNA report, clinical white paper, laboratory header visible even from where I stood. He held up a bundle of letters tied with kitchen twine, yellowed, handwritten. Richard Voss to Linda. Love letters. Garrett and Elena shared the same father. The sound that came out of the crowd wasn't a gasp. It was a vacuum. 300 people inhaling at once. I looked at Constance. She didn't faint gracefully. She folded. Her legs gave out and she dropped into a chair like someone had cut her strings, one hand over her mouth, mascara already running. He cannot find out before tomorrow. Now I knew who he was. Now I knew why she couldn't look at Linda all weekend. She'd been sitting across from her dead husband's mistress for 3 days. Elena turned to her mother. That careful composure, that porcelain control I'd watched her maintain since the rehearsal dinner. It shattered in a single sentence. "You knew, and you let me walk down that aisle," Constance sobbed, and nodded. Linda hadn't moved. She stood in the second row, white as the limestone walls of that estate, hands gripping the chair in front of her. Not shocked, not confused, terrified. The look of a woman who'd been carrying a secret for 3 decades and had just watched it detonate in front of everyone she knew. I turned to Garrett last. I wish I hadn't. He wasn't crying. He wasn't shouting. He was just standing there with the ring still pinched between his thumb and forefinger, staring at Marcus like he was trying to translate a language he'd never heard before. Then his face did something I'd never seen a human face do. It didn't crumble. It emptied. Everything behind his eyes just left. The joy, the trust, the wide-open goodness that had made him Garrett since the day he was born. Gone. Like someone had reached in and turned off a light. He was my kid brother. And I was 3 feet away. And there was not a single thing on this earth I could do. 3 days, 72 hours in a Kingston motor hotel with curtains that smelled like they'd been closed since the 90s. The bar downstairs had 6 stools, wood so dark it looked wet, a television mounted in the corner playing baseball highlights no one cared about. I sat on stool 4. Garrett sat on stool 2. A gap between us like a missing tooth. He hadn't shaved, hadn't changed his shirt. He'd roll the wedding ring across the bar top with one finger, back and forth, this quiet, terrible rhythm. Then he'd stop, stare at nothing, and drink. He wouldn't see anyone, not Elena, not friends. He let me stay because I'm his brother, full brother, half brother. I don't think he even knew what to call me anymore. But I was there, and that was enough. On the 3rd night, I called our mother. I stepped into the hallway by the ice machine, fluorescent light buzzing overhead. She picked up on the first ring like she'd been holding the phone for 3 days. "Dale?" Her voice was small, careful. "Tell me about Richard Voss." Silence. Then breathing. Then, "What do you want me to say?" "I want you to say what's true, Mom, for once." And she did. It started in the spring of '87. Richard Voss, Elena's father, a man who'd been dead now for 9 years, walked into the framing shop where our mother worked part-time in Rhinebeck. She said it was immediate. She said it was reckless. She said our father, my father, the man who taught Garrett to throw a football, who drove him to every Little League game, who died in 2014 still believing that boy was his. Never suspected a thing. The affair lasted through the end of that year. Garrett was born the following spring. "When did the money start?" I asked. Another silence. Longer this time. "Linda." "The fall," she whispered. "After Garrett was born. Richard came to the house while your father was at work. He handed me an envelope, said it was for the boy's future. I told him I didn't want it. But you took it. Every year, Dale, every year until he died. And then, the payments continued. From the estate. A quarterly disbursement. I never asked who authorized it. I cashed the checks." My hand was shaking. I pressed it flat against the wall, felt the cold of the cinder block through my palm. Dad died thinking Garrett was his son. Yes, that word. That tiny, ruinous word. It sat in my chest like a stone. I hung up, didn't say goodbye. Couldn't. When I walked back into the bar, Garrett was hunched over his phone, both hands flat on the bar top, like he was bracing against an earthquake. His jaw was tight. That way it gets right before he either breaks down or puts his fist through drywall. He didn't look at me. He just tapped the screen and set the phone on the bar between us, and Elena's voice spilled out from a voicemail on speaker. Thin, unsteady, but precise. "Garrett, I'm not angry at you. I need you to know that. None of this is something either of us did, but I need you to hear something. Marcus didn't find those letters on his own. He couldn't have. They were in a locked file cabinet in my father's study, a room my mother sealed after he died. No one had a key except family. Someone opened that room. Someone pulled those documents, packaged them, and mailed them to Marcus in Lisbon, with a note telling him to come home immediately." A pause. I could hear her breathing. "I think it was my Aunt Vivian. If I married you, it triggered an inheritance clause in my father's trust. a clause that would have redirected millions away from Vivian's share. She needed the wedding stopped, Garrett, and she found the one piece of truth ugly enough to stop it. The voicemail ended. A soft beep, then nothing. Just the murmur of the television and the bartender drying a glass he'd already dried twice. Garrett stared at the phone like it was a thing that might bite him. "She used Marcus," he said quietly. Not a question. I didn't answer right away, but something turned over in my chest, something cold and familiar, something I hadn't felt since I put the badge down. Not rage, not grief. Smaller than that. Sharper. The reflex you develop after 23 years of working cases. The moment you stop staring at the wreckage and start looking for the hand that lit the match. Somebody built this. Somebody pulled documents from a dead man's locked study, routed them through Lisbon, and detonated a family at the altar. And they did it for money. I finished my bourbon. Set the glass down gently. I didn't say anything dramatic. Didn't announce a thing. But Garrett looked at me, really looked at me for the first time in 3 days. And I think he saw it in my face. That shift. It was time to work. A week out from the wedding, I drove to Connecticut. Hadn't slept much. Hadn't needed to. Something had clicked over inside me that last night at the motor hotel. Garrett saw it happen, watched my face change while Elena's voicemail was still hanging in the air between us. And once that switch flips, you don't turn it off. 23 years with a badge teaches you a lot of things, but the one that sticks is this. People who destroy lives always leave a trail. They can't help it. Arrogance is a sloppy housekeeper. Vivian Voss lived on the old Constance family estate. Stone walls, iron gate, hedgerows trimmed like they owed somebody money. I rang the bell and a housekeeper let me into a sitting room that smelled like lavender and old money. Vivian came down 10 minutes later. Made me wait. That told me plenty. She was mid-60s, silver hair pulled tight, wearing a cashmere wrap like armor. I introduced myself as Garrett's brother, watched her eyes do exactly nothing. "I'm sorry for whatever difficulty your family is experiencing," she said. Thin smile, practiced sympathy. "But I don't see how I can help." I asked about the letters, about Richard's sealed study, the one Elena's mother had closed up after his death, about how documents locked inside a dead man's office ended up in her nephew's hands halfway across the world. She denied everything. Calmly, elegantly. The way people deny things when they've had years to rehearse. But here's what Vivian didn't account for. She saw a grieving relative sitting on her settee. She didn't see the thing I used to be. And she didn't notice me clocking the leather portfolio on her foyer table, embossed with the name Ackerman and Price. Same firm, same attorney who'd handled every amendment to Richard Voss's family trust for the past 11 years. I didn't push, thanked her for her time, let her think she'd won. Then I went to work. 3 days. Courthouse filings, a favor from an old contact at the state records office, a couple of phone calls I probably had no business making anymore. But the picture assembled itself the way they always do, piece by ugly piece. Vivian had petitioned to restructure the Voss family trust 8 months before the wedding, and buried in the original trust language was a dormant clause. If Elena married, $14 million would redirect into her control and away from Vivian's. 14 million. That's what 2 people's happiness was worth to that woman, a number on a ledger she refused to lose. She'd had the ammunition for years. Executor privileges had given her access to Richard's study long after Elena's mother sealed it. She'd found Linda's letters to Richard, the proof of the affair, the proof of Garrett. And Vivian had folded those letters up, put them back in the cabinet, and waited. 5 years she sat on that knowledge like a coiled spring, patient as a spider. When the engagement was announced, she moved. an anonymous package mailed to Marcus's apartment in Lisbon. Inside, the letters, a consumer DNA testing kit, something I hadn't known about until I pulled the shipping records, and a handwritten note with no signature, urging him to come home before it was too late. She didn't just give the kid suspicion. She gave him the tools to build certainty. Then she stepped back and let gravity do the rest. I found Marcus at a coffee shop in New Paltz. He looked hollowed out, thinner than wedding photos suggested. I sat down across from him, and I didn't accuse him of anything. I just asked. He broke in under a minute. "It showed up at my door," he said, voice cracking, coffee untouched. "No return address, no name. I did the test, and it confirmed everything the letters said. I thought I was protecting my sister. I didn't know someone sent me there." He put his face in his hands, and I felt something shift in my chest. The anger I'd been carrying for him since that night at the motor hotel just drained out, because I was looking at a kid who'd been picked up like a stone, aimed at his own sister's wedding, and thrown, and he never once felt the hand that held him. Vivian hadn't just destroyed a marriage. She'd weaponized a brother's love, used it like a detonator, and she'd done it all for money she was afraid to lose. I sat there in that coffee shop, watching Marcus fall apart, and I thought about Garrett back in Kingston, rolling his wedding ring on a bar top. I thought about Elena's voice on that voicemail, calm, measured, trying to make sense of wreckage someone else had engineered. Two people who loved each other, demolished by a woman who'd been planning this since before they ever met. 5 years. She waited 5 years. Some people, I swear, the cold runs all the way down to the bone. 2 weeks after the altar. 2 weeks since everything came apart in front of 112 people who'd bought plane tickets and wrapped gifts. I called Garrett on a Tuesday. He picked up on the 5th ring, and the silence on his end told me more than any words could. I just said, "Come to the cabin, Friday. There's something you need to see." He didn't ask what. He didn't argue. I think some part of him had been waiting. Elena. I reached through her attorney. Left a message. She called back within the hour, same voice from that voicemail, steady and controlled, like a woman holding a cracked glass with both hands. She said she'd be there. Garrett arrived first, gravel popping under his tires around noon. He looked like he'd lost 15 pounds. Elena pulled in 40 minutes later. I watched them see each other through the kitchen window. Neither one moved for a long time. Then Garrett held the screen door open for her, and it caught on the frame the way it always does, and she stepped inside. And that was it. They were in the same room. I'd laid everything on the kitchen table the way I would have briefed a case. Folders, printed filings, a timeline I'd drawn by hand on legal paper, dates running down the left margin like a spine. The trust petition, 8 months before the wedding. Vivian's executor access records, the sealed study, the letters, the DNA kit purchase trail I'd pulled through a contact at the shipping company. 5 years of a woman sitting on a grenade, waiting for someone to hand it to. I didn't editorialize. I walked them through it piece by piece and let the paper do the talking. Elena didn't cry. She read every document, turned pages with the tip of one finger like they might cut her. When she got to the trust clause, the 14 million, her jaw set and something behind her eyes went cold and permanent. She looked at Garrett. He looked at the table. She said, "She did this for money." Not a question. Garrett barely spoke. He nodded in the places you'd expect. But I could see him doing the math no one wants to do, recalculating every Christmas, every birthday, every time our mother looked at him. I knew that math. I'd been doing it myself for 3 days. Later, after Elena stepped out to call her attorney, Garrett and I ended up on the porch, bugs hitting the light, neither of us talking. Then he said, quiet, almost like he was afraid of the answer, Do you still think of me as your real brother? And I wanted to say something clean, something easy. But the truth is, my throat locked up because my mind went to Dad. Our dad. The man I buried 7 years ago who went into the ground not knowing that his wife had... I had to breathe through it. Dad never knew, I said. He died not knowing. And that cuts me just as deep as it cuts you, Garrett. Maybe deeper because I have to wonder what it would have done to him. He didn't look at me. I didn't look at him. Then I said it, and my voice broke halfway through, and I didn't care. Blood is just chemistry. Brotherhood is a choice, and I chose you a long time ago. He put his hand on the back of my neck and squeezed, and we stayed like that until the bugs got bad. That night, around 9, Elena's phone rang. Vivian's attorney. A settlement offer. Vivian would relinquish control of the trust entirely if Elena dropped the legal challenge. No court. No public record. Clean and quiet, the way Vivian had always preferred things. Elena listened. Then she said one word. No. And she hung up. The cabin got very still after that. I looked at Elena standing in the kitchen doorway, phone still in her hand, and I understood something clearly. Vivian Voss had spent 5 years being patient. She was about to find out what patience really looked like. 6 months. That's how long it took for the whole thing to grind through the system. 6 months of depositions, filings, motions, counter-motions, lawyers talking to other lawyers, all of them billing by the hour, while 3 people who used to sit around the same Thanksgiving table couldn't be in the same zip code as their mother. Elena never blinked. Not once. That woman walked into a courtroom with every document I'd spread across that cabin table, and she laid Vivian's entire architecture bare under fluorescent lights and a judge who didn't suffer theatrics. The ruling came down on a Wednesday in October. Fraudulent trust manipulation. Vivian was removed as trustee entirely. The inheritance clause she'd built her little empire around, voided. $14 million restructured fairly among all family members. And then there was the line that broke me. Buried in the legalese, in a paragraph most people would skim, the court's ruling included a provision formally acknowledging Garrett as the biological son of Richard Voss, entitled to a share he never once asked for. My father died 7 years ago without knowing the truth. He never got to say the words, but a judge in a county courthouse said them for him, in ink on the record. And I sat in my truck in the parking lot afterward and cried like I hadn't cried since we buried Dad. Garrett and Elena did not get back together. You already know why. Whatever they'd built in those years of courtship, whatever they'd imagined standing at that altar, it was made impossible by the same blood that now connected them. But here's the thing nobody expected, maybe least of all them. They became family. Real family. I'd catch them on the phone some evenings, not talking about the case, not talking about Vivian, just talking. Brother and sister finding the shape of something that had been there all along, hidden underneath the lie. Marcus came back around eventually. Once he understood he'd been a pawn, that Vivian had fed him just enough to make him dangerous at exactly the right moment. The anger drained out of him, and what was left was shame. Elena forgave him, quietly. No ceremony to it. Linda wrote Garrett a letter. Long one, several pages from what he told me. An apology. He read it. He hasn't written back. I don't ask him about it. That's his to carry, and he'll set it down when he's ready. I'm standing at the vineyard now, same venue. The place where 112 people watched everything come apart. It's early spring, and there's nothing here. The vines are bare, cut back to the wood, the rows stripped clean for the season. No chairs, no arch, no flowers. Just cold dirt and the smell of something trying to wake up underneath it. Funny thing about vineyards. Everything that matters happens where you can't see it. The roots run deep and tangled under the surface, and they'll either feed what grows above or strangle it dead in the dark. For 5 years, our mother chose to let the secret twist tighter and tighter underground, and by the time it surfaced, it had wrapped itself around every single one of us. But we cut it out. Not cleanly. Not without losing things we can't get back. My father's peace. Garrett's sense of who he was. A wedding that should have been the happiest day of 2 people's lives. The truth cost us all of that. And it was still the only thing that set us free. The sun's going down behind the hills now, that deep orange kind of light that makes everything look like it's burning slow. I take one last look at the empty rows, the bare posts, the quiet dirt. Then I turn around and walk away. My boots on the gravel are the only sound for miles.